At the top of yesterday's briefing, you heard from Tom Homan and John Huber about how important the two immigration bills the House will be voting on today are in our efforts to secure the border and protect our communities. This morning, Secretary Kelly spoke about Kate's Law and the No Sanctuary for Criminals Act on the Hill, important legislation that is supported by 80% of Americans. Yesterday, the President heard the tragic stories of the innocent American lives that were ended by a violent individual who should never have been allowed into our country or our communities. A star high school athlete from Los Angeles who was killed by a member of the 18th Street Gang while his mother was serving her second tour of duty in Iraq, and Joshua Wilkerson, who was brutally beaten and tortured to death by his classmate in Texas, who then set his body on fire. Christy Pena, a 14-year-old girl who was raped and murdered by a man who had multiple warrants out for other crimes involving kidnapping and rape. 25 years later, he was finally located in his native Mexico, where he fled after murdering Christy in 1990. The President also heard from federal immigration officials and local sheriffs who are on the front lines of this fight to protect innocent American lives. These laws will help to empower the federal government in partnership with local authorities to more easily locate and remove these violent individuals and prevent so-called sanctuary cities from receiving benefits from the very agency whose rules they are refusing to enforce. The President looks forward to seeing these common sense proposals pass the House today so we can be one step closer to helping fulfill his campaign promise to help stop these horrific crimes. Yesterday, we were disappointed to see that people living in 14 out of Nevada's 18 counties will be left without a single choice on the state's Obamacare exchanges, specifically citing difficulties due to a shrinking and deteriorating market. And to add insult to injury, the thousands of people living in Nevada without access to health insurance on the Obamacare exchanges will then be taxed for not having insurance that isn't even available to them. This is yet another reminder that Obamacare is continuing to collapse, leaving millions of people around the country suffering and the consequences of this failed law. The Vice President is back on the Hill this afternoon for one-on-one meetings on health care. As work continues this week towards repealing and replacing Obamacare, we are keeping these American families, business owners, and individuals at the front of our minds. They've been paying ever-increasing premiums and still losing their plans and their doctors. And it's time for Republicans in the Senate to fulfill their promise to the American people and come together around a consensus plan to fix this broken system. In terms of the schedule for today, this afternoon, the President will make a big speech on the importance of American energy dominance at the Department of Energy. The United States has been reliant on other countries for our energy for decades. But with new innovations and advances, particularly in liquid natural gas, we have had the opportunity to not only become energy independent, but to use our abundant resources as an important tool in advancing our global interests. I'm going to let the President get into more details on how we're going to do that later this afternoon. Hopefully you'll all tune in. There have been a few questions asked this week that and Sean and I both said that we would get back to you on. I want to address a couple of those now. On Monday, Sean was asked how we knew that the Supreme Court's ruling on the President's travel executive order was 9-0 when the decision was announced. In fact, the decision, which stayed the lower court's injunction on the President's executive order for all affected individuals without a bona fide connection to a person or entity in the United States, was unanimous on the point that the stay should be granted at least to that extent. 3 justices would have gone further and stayed the injunctions in full. No justice dissented on the point that the stay should be granted in part, and no justice indicated that he or she did not participate in the decision. Jennifer Jacobs from Bloomberg also asked about the IMF's projection about U.S. growth. This morning, the Commerce Department revised first quarter GDP upward, but both the IMF and the Commerce Department's figures show we still have much more work to do. The President has spoken out clearly about the need for faster and more sustainable economic growth that will create jobs and raise incomes for Americans. The IMF has expressed support for a lot of the President's policies, including more infrastructure spending, reforming our tax code, boosting educational outcomes, and adopting family-friendly policies. The President is also working to end job-killing government regulations and negotiate good trade policies that help workers. Lastly, Jordan Fabian from The Hill asked what deal breakers exist in Senate negotiations on the health care bill. The The president isn't going to negotiate in public, but he has laid out his priorities to repeal and replace Obamacare with a system that provides greater choices and better coverage at lower cost. I can tell you that Obamacare is failing and new policy is around the corner. From our ongoing negotiations, we're confident that any amendments the Senate agrees to will make the bill stronger. The other bill out there that's gained the support of a majority of House Democrats is the Bernie Sanders single-payer plan that would cost the government $32 trillion over the next decades. 113 House Democrats, including the DNC vice chair, have signed on to this approach. The president believes that it's completely unaffordable and creates a one-size-fits-all government approach to health care. That bill and others like it on the other side that have been proposed are clearly deal breakers. Now that I've answered a couple of the questions from earlier this week, be happy to take a few now. John Roberts.
Sarah, in reference to the president's tweets this morning that have been a matter of some discussion today, you said earlier on Fox News that the president has a right to defend himself when he is attacked, and it's no secret that this particular program has been very critical of him. However, the nature of the tweets this morning has drawn condemnation from people on Capitol Hill, including the Speaker of the House, Senator Graham, Senator Susan Collins, all of whom are allies of the president. Did the president go too far with this tweet in its deeply personal nature?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that the president has been attacked mercilessly on personal accounts by members on that program. And I think he's been very clear that when he gets attacked, he's going to hit back. I think the American people elected somebody who's tough, who's smart, and who's a fighter. And that's Donald Trump. And I don't think that it's a surprise to anybody that he fights fire with fire. The things that this show has called him, and not just him, but numerous members of his staff, including myself and many others, are very deeply personal. So to then turn and pretend like, this approach is, I guess it's kind of like we're living in the Twilight Zone. They do this day after day after day, and then the president responds and defends himself, and everybody is appalled and blown away. Frankly, if this had happened in the previous administration, the type of attacks launched on this program, the things they say, utterly stupid, personality disorder, mentally ill, constant personal attacks, calling multiple members liars to their faces while they're sitting on their programs, the rest of the media would have said, guys, no way, hold on. But nobody does that. But the president, he's not going to step back. He's showed that, and that's exactly what he did today.
If I could just follow on that, Sarah, a couple of the criticisms from supporters of the president have been that this particular tweet was beneath the dignity of the office. Where does the president draw that line on the dignity of the office?
Look, I think that he shows that every day in the decisions that he's making, the focus and the priorities he's laid out in his agenda. But he's not going to sit back and be attacked by the liberal media, Hollywood elites, and when they hit him, he's going to hit back.
Sarah? I have a healthcare question, but on this, just one other aspect of it. Some have suggested in their tweet response or public announcements today that the president misconstrued one of the messages that should have been gathered from the shooting that involved Steve Scalise and others, that the hostility of the verbal environment can create an atmosphere of violence. I'm not saying that, but members of Congress have said that about this particular tweet. I know that episode affected the president and those here at the White House personally, very importantly and deeply. Do you have any reaction to that sentiment that conversations like this create an atmosphere that is either dangerous or one we need to avoid?
The president in no way, form, or fashion has ever promoted or encouraged violence. If anything, quite the contrary. And he was simply pushing back and defending himself.
Sarah, I do have a healthcare question. I have a healthcare question. So, you talked about the president's overall priorities. Late last night, as part of the amendment and evolution of the Senate draft, $45 billion was put on the table for opioid treatment, and health savings accounts can be used, according to this new draft, to pay premiums in the future. Does the president support those two initiatives? And why does he believe they make the bill better? Specifically, does he believe that opioid allocation will be sufficient, because many people do not, to address that problem?
I'm not going to negotiate the details, the back and forth in public, but I can tell you the president has obviously made fighting the opioid crisis a priority for him, and I would imagine he would be supportive of pushing resources towards that.
Savings accounts. Does he have
I
any
think we're always
particular
looking for ways to add additional flexibilities and something certainly to be considered.
What about the Republicans who are criticizing the president?
I want to go back to the shooting and remember what President Trump said then. He said, our country will perhaps become closer, more unified, so important. Does his tweet this morning, his series of tweets, help to unify the country?
Again, Kristen, I think I've asked, and this question has been asked, and I've answered it several times.
Do his tweets help to unify the country, to do what he said he wanted to see happen in the wake of that shooting?
Look, again, I think that the president is pushing back against people who attack him day after day after day. Where is the outrage on that? You guys are constantly coming and asking, like, is this okay? He does it one time. This is day after day after day. And it's not just the president. The only person that I see a war on is this president and everybody that works for him.
There are two questions to follow up on that. One is that I understand your point, but he is the president of the United States. They are cable news anchors, so he has to stand to a higher standard. One. And two, you talk about criticism. He said that former President Obama wasn't born in this country, right? So he clearly was a part of criticizing the past president, who was not immune to criticism himself. So I wonder how you make that argument.
Again, I think I've been pretty clear that when the president gets hit, he's going to hit back harder, which is what he did here today.
Doesn't he have to meet a higher standard than cable news anchors? Sarah, doesn't he have to meet a higher standard than cable news anchors?
Look, I don't think you can expect someone to be personally attacked day after day, minute by minute, and sit back. Look, the American people elected a fighter. They didn't elect somebody to sit back and do nothing. They knew what they were getting when they voted for Donald Trump, and he won overwhelmingly.
Sarah, how is insulting a woman
Given
on
the-
Twitter being a fighter?
What about the impact of statements like this on his effectiveness? There was a Marist poll this week that said 68% of registered voters said the president's tweets are reckless and distracting. Only 22% say that they're effective and informative. And Republicans on this question are split down the middle. Half of Republicans say that they're reckless and distracting. So how can you argue that this is something the president must do?
I answered this question yesterday in regards to the poll. I think anytime the president has a chance to speak directly to the American people, it's a good thing.
Sarah, as a woman, how do you feel about the president attacking another woman specifically for her looks, and what does that show as an example to how men should be treating other women?
Look, everybody wants to make this an attack on a woman and equality. What about the constant attacks that he receives or the rest of us? I'm a woman and I've been attacked by this show multiple times, but I don't cry foul because of it. I think that, you want to create this false narrative. One hand, it's like, let's treat everybody equally, and on the other hand, they attack, and he responds, and apparently that's wrong. I'm sorry, guys. I've answered this question. Allie.
Why can't he take the heat?
Too, and this kind of gets to the point that's been made, and
Exactly. This is the
City-
point
I
that's
wanna-
been made, so I'm not sure why we're continuing
You've
to
been
answer
talking
the
about the
same
idea that the
question.
president is a fighter. I just want to put it in because you talk about being personally affected by all of this as well, and that nothing is wrong with the president fighting fire with fire is the argument that you're making. So I would ask this to you, sort of on a personal level. You have stood here and talked about your family from this podium. Are you going to tell your kids this behavior is okay?
Look, I've been asked before when it comes to role models as a person of faith. I think we all have one perfect role model. And when I'm asked that question, I point to God, I point to my faith, and that's where I would tell my kids to look. None of us are perfect, and certainly there's only one that is, and that's where I would point that direction.
I want to ask you my follow-up question just on more policy points with the G20 coming up next
That
week.
would be a change in tone policy.
I disagree with that. I think we talk about policy a lot here, but I want to ask about his meeting with President Putin that is coming up next week that has just been confirmed by Gary Cohn and HR McMaster. And a definitive answer from you on whether the president will bring up election interference. It is clearly the biggest topic between the U.S. and Russia right now, the fact that Moscow meddled in the election. Is the president going to press Putin on that?
Obviously, I'm not going to get ahead of the president's conversation, as we typically do. I would imagine we'll have a readout after that conversation takes place. John,
Thanks.
I'll come to you next.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sarah. The president's tweet today, does it help his legislative agenda? Does it help him win the votes of those 9 senators who have come out against that Senate bill? Senator Collins, Senator Murkowski, for instance. What's your view on that?
Again, I think we're just looking for new ways to rephrase this question. The president was attacked. He responded. There's nothing more I have to add than that. John, busy.
As to his legislative agenda, I'm not asking about the tweet
Look, I
itself.
think the president
I'm
would-
asking about whether or not this helps his legislative agenda.
I think the president would love for us all to focus on the legislative agenda a whole lot more. You look at the coverage over the last month of the extended period between May and June, all of the major networks, if you look at their coverage and what they're talking about, they spent 1 minute in the evening newscast talking about tax reform, 3 minutes on infrastructure, 5 minutes on the economy and jobs, 17 minutes on healthcare, and 353 minutes attacking the president and pushing a false narrative on Russia. I mean, look at that in comparison. If you guys want to talk about legislative agenda and focus on policy and priorities, you guys get to help set that table. And 353 minutes of attacks against the president and driving a false narrative, and 1 minute on tax reform. That's over the course of a month. That's incredible. The numbers, guys, the numbers don't lie. The media's focus on priorities, they don't line up with the rest of America. Right now, we've got our economy's growing, the stock market's up, unemployment is down, jobs are back, and ISIS is on the run. America is winning, and that's what we'd like to talk about. But you guys constantly ignore that narrative.
Points that you
Go ahead,
make, Sarah,
John.
all of those points that you make, Sarah, about the
I'm sorry,
positive
John.
elements of what the president's agenda are certainly true. All of those things are true. But the president today put out this tweet which takes away from all of that. And you expect us here in this room to simply ignore that? I think that's the valid question that should be asked of you right now. Should we just ignore this entirely?
I think he's put out a number of tweets on healthcare, on the immigration bills that'll be in the House today, but that's not being talked about. That's not being asked about. But the discrepancy, again, 353 minutes. You can't say that you want to talk about policy and then you look at the numbers and they just don't lie. You can't expect for that amount of attack and intensity to come on a president and him to never respond. John Gizzi. I said I was going to John Gizzi next.
2 questions for you, Sarah. First, did the U.S. administration send a representative to the funeral mass for Chancellor Kohl, or will they send anyone to the official funeral service July 1st?
I do believe that there is an official delegation. I'll have to get details back to you on that.
The question is this: you've had people turn down nomination to be Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. The President's on his 3rd appointee, I believe, for Secretary of the Army. And the ambassador to Ireland has declined the nomination, and there's no candidates for ambassador to Germany or France, both major allies, or Greece for that matter, an important country. Is the president having trouble recruiting people to fill some of the key slots that remain unfilled after 6 months?
No, John, actually the trouble isn't in the recruitment, it's in the vetting and getting them through the process. Like I mentioned yesterday, there are over, I believe, 100 candidates in the queue waiting to be pushed through, but due to the historic obstruction, it's taking much longer than normal to get a lot of those nominees through. And frankly, a lot of the people that are part of that process, one of the number one reasons we've had people take a step back is because that process is so lengthy. And hold on, I've got a Skype question from Chris Berg in North Dakota, and we'll go to that.
Hey, Sarah, thank you so much. I don't want to talk about any tweets. I want to talk about making America great, part of the energy dominance and energy. Here's the thing. During the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, we had some pretty scary times through North Dakota. Just a couple weeks ago, a judge made a decision suggesting that the Army Corps of Engineers may have prematurely issued some permits. This creates more uncertainty. My question is this. What specifically is the administration going to do to give these companies more certainty, more clarity as they make these billion infrastructure investments to move our energy. At the same point in time, our tribal leaders and tribal nations are feeling honored and respected throughout this entire permitting process.
It was a little difficult to hear, but I believe the question was focused on energy production specific to Dakota Access. And I think we've been talking consistently about this. The president is dedicated to increasing energy production in the United States, and we're doing a part of the review of the Dakota Access Pipeline. It's the administration working with those tribal leaders and stakeholders throughout that process to make it as successful as possible. A lot of the tribal leaders also want to expand energy production and development in their area, and we're going to work continuously with them to try to make that as successful as possible. Jordan?
Thank you, Sarah. I want to ask you again about this Russia sanctions legislation in Congress. If, as Treasury Secretary Mnuchin said, the administration wants to go to the upper limits of the law in keeping those sanctions on Russia, then why not support this legislation that basically keeps what has been slapped down in place?
Yeah, again, we're continuing to review that process until there's final legislation there. I've got another Skype question from Greg Merriweather in Louisiana. Hopefully we'll be able
Sarah,
to
our
hear him
question
a
is
little
on
better.
healthcare. Specifically, our governor put out a number that perhaps hundreds of thousands of people in Louisiana will lose their health care if this bill goes through. If you add the other states, that kind of puts it into the billion. Is there an acceptable number you all talked about behind the scenes of people losing coverage to get the greater bill through?
Again, I'm having a little difficulty hearing, but as best I could understand, you're looking at how Obamacare repeal and replace would affect the state of Louisiana. And I mean, frankly, Louisiana has been one of the hardest hit states in the country by Obamacare. Their insurance premiums have gone up over 125%. The goal here is to give people in the country choices. No one who currently has Medicaid will have their benefits cut. We're looking across the board, the healthcare plans that will lower taxes, reduce premiums, and offer more choices for people in Louisiana and across the country. And hopefully that somewhat addressed your question as best I could. Margaret?
Yeah.
Sarah, I had a two-parter. The president had let us know that he had planned on having an ISIS news conference to update people on the situation within the next couple weeks, which is nowish, but we're coming up on departure from...
Nowish an official word.
It's nowish. I'm wondering, do you expect that we would get that update, whether it's a news conference or just kind of remarks, before the upcoming foreign trip, or whether we need to wait? And I also wanted to ask you, it looked like there might be some coverage of remarks at the fundraiser yesterday. It didn't work out. But beyond yesterday, are you guys looking at beginning to do that now for fundraisers of a certain size, to have some transparency or the ability to hear what he's telling donors?
Yeah, yesterday it was a logistical issue. Trying to make that and accommodate at the last minute was going to be a little bit complicated, certainly on the table for future events. As for the first question, we'll keep you posted when we have an announcement on that. As you guys know, the president is getting ready to depart for the Department of Energy, and we'll be speaking on that soon. Thanks so much.